Lesson 1 for Module 8, IPv6 GUA assignment or Global Unicast Address assignment. And the objective of this lesson is to help you be able to explain how an IPv6 host can acquire its IPv6 configuration. Okay, so we're referring to either a IPv6 enabled laptop or desktop or mobile device or printer, any end device. As long as it's IPv6 enabled, how does it acquire its IPv6 configuration from the network? So in this lesson, we help you understand how that is done. So first things first, to use either stateless address auto configuration or sometimes stateless auto address configuration, that's SLAC or DHCP version 6, you should review two important terms. It's global unicast addresses, GUAs, and link local addresses or LLAs. Now on a router, an IP version 6 global unicast address, the GUA, is manually configured. Okay, it's manually configured using the IPv6 address and prefix length configuration command, which means that you have to go into the router just like how we assign a normal IPv4 address on an interface. So you will type, instead of IPv4, type IPv, you type IPv6 address, and then you type in the address. That's for a router. Now for a Windows host machine, this can be manually configured with an IPv6 GUA or global unicast address configuration, as you can see here. Okay, global unicast address configuration that can be done manually on a Windows host machine. Now if you're looking at in a larger network, okay, in a larger network where you have more than one device, you have a number of devices, mid-enterprise networks, manually entering an IPv6 global unicast address or GUA can be a very time-consuming and somewhat error-prone task as a network administrator. Therefore, most Windows hosts, they are enabled to dynamically acquire an IPv6 GUA configuration. Okay, so we go and obtain an IPv6 address automatically. Dynamic address configuration will be selected, and that dynamic option will be selected normally in the IPv4 address config address property dialog box. Okay, so because of the time-consuming task involved in this, the best option to assign IP addresses in an IPv6 enabled or in an IPv4 enabled is to allow for obtaining an address automatically. So this is where we now look at these two terms. What does the global unicast address do, or what's the purpose of the GUA, and then what's the purpose of the LLA, the link local address? So first of all, we look at the IPv6 host link local address. What's the purpose of the link local address? Okay, so when automatic IPv6 addressing is selected, as we've seen in the previous slide, the host will attempt to automatically obtain and configure IPv6 address on the interface. Now the host will use one of three methods that are defined by the Internet Control Message Protocol or ICMP version 6, router advertisement messages. Okay, so that's the array messages we are referring to. Array messages, okay, ICMP v6 array messages. It will use three, okay, it will use one of the three messages that are used that are defined by the ICMP v6 router advertisement messages received on the interface. So an IPv6 router that is on the same link as the host that is requiring an IPv6 address automatically, the router will send out an array message that suggests to the host how to obtain their IPv6 address information. Now the IPv6 link local address is automatically created by the host. Notice, by the host. Okay. As soon as the host boots up and the Ethernet interface or its network interface card is active, and it picks up a network interface card, or it picks up a wireless connection and it's active, it's connected, it automatically creates a link local address. So if you go ahead to the command prompt and you type ipconfig, you will notice it will automatically have assigned or generated a link local address on the interface already. So an example is provided here. Okay, you can see that the interface did not create an IPv6 global unicast address, but rather it created a link local address and not a global unicast. See, there's no global unicast. Now the reason to this is because for particularly in this example, the network segment does not have a router to provide that information. Okay, it does not have a router to provide network config instructions for this host. Okay, so what does this mean? Every time you enable a host device to obtain an IPv6 address automatically, by default, when you boot up the device, it generates its own link local IPv6 address, as long as it can determine that the network interface card is active or the Ethernet connection is active. However, if there is no router that's configured to lease out IPv6 addresses, it will not pick up a global unicast address, but it can automatically generate its own link local address. Okay, so that's the main key point that I want you to take at this consider at this stage. Now do note that host operating systems will at times show a link local address appended with a percentage symbol and a number. Okay, can you see that here? It can be assigned dynamically using stateless and stateful services. Okay, the next slide we will look at how can we differentiate between these two. Okay, what does it mean by stateless and what does it mean by stateful service? Now all stateless and stateful methods in this module that we're going to look at, they use IPv6 array messages. Okay, that's a key point to remember. Regardless whether it's stateless or stateful, they use IPv6 router advertisement messages to suggest to the host how to create or acquire its IPv6 configuration. Now, although most operating systems follow the suggestion of the array, the actual decision is ultimately up to the host itself. Now, have a look at this diagram on your right hand side. Okay, we have dynamic GUA assignment. Notice there are two ways where GUA can be assigned. Okay, can be assigned via stateless, which basically means no device is tracking the assignment of IPv6 addresses. Okay, you manually assign, or it's stateful. You have a DHCP version 6 server who is responsible for assigning the address as well as managing the IPv6 address. Okay, so stateless and stateful, stateless and stateful. And then under stateless, can you see we have two methods again? We can go Slack only or Slack with a little bit of help from the DHCP server. Okay, now this is known as stateless DHCP version 6. On the other hand, you have stateful. Okay, we have DHCP version 6 server who is doing everything. Now this is known as stateful DHCP version 6. So in other words, we can say these are the three ways. Okay, these are the three messages. Okay, Slack only, stateless DHCP version 6, stateful DHCP version 6. Now it's quite simple. This concept is very simple. If you look at Slack only, okay, just by looking at this summary here. The router sends the router advertisement array messages providing all the IPv6 addressing information. That is network prefix, prefix length, default gateway info. The host uses the array information exclusively for all the addressing, including creating their own global unicast address. Okay, that's SLAAC only. The router sends the information and the host takes that information and uses it to create its own GUA. Now with stateless DHCP version 6, again you still have the router array messages that provide the IPv6 config information to the host and informs them to contact a stateless DHCP version 6 server for additional config information. So what this means is that with SLAAC, it's more or less manually. Okay, the router sends the array message providing all the IPv6 information, and the host uses that array information and generates its own GUA. It manages its own GUA. With SLAAC, with DHCP version 6 or stateless DHCP version 6, it combines a bit of both. Okay, it relies on the IPv6, the array messages, but it also has to contact a DHCP version 6 stateless server to pick up just some information, not all the information, just some information only. So it's a bit of both. If you look at the other, the blue box, you look at stateful. Stateful, everything is taken care of by the DHCP version 6 server. You see, the router array messages inform the host to contact a stateful DHCP version 6 server or a DHCP version 6 enabled router for all IPv6 config information except the default gateway address. Hosts contact a DHCP version 6 server to acquire all of their IPv6 addressing information. See, again, all. And then hosts obtain a default gateway information from router array messages. So to bring all this into context, assuming we have a router here, okay, we have a router here and we have a PC here. Okay, PC is connected to a switch in between, switch is connected to a router, and we have other networks here as well. Now let's concentrate on this PCA. If we were to configure PCA in this IPv6 environment as SLAAC only, then PCA will just check, if there are array messages. If the router sends by default, remember IPv6 enabled router by default periodically sends ICMPv6 arrays, router advertisements, which means that this router is going to advertise. So here we have PCA who will receive that array message, assuming it's SLAAC only. Will receive that array message and then it will generate its own GUA. Okay? It will use that array information and then it will generate its own global unicast address. That's SLAAC only. Now, where you have stateless DHCP version 6, again, it will receive the array message, but the router will tell that PCA, here is a little bit of info I can provide for you, but you will have to contact a stateless DHCP version 6 server to provide you additional information. Okay, that's clear. Now, on the other hand, with stateful DHCP version 6, the array messages go to the PCA, telling the PCA, contact the DHCP version 6 server or a DHCP version 6 enable router. In this case, if this was 1, contact me for all of your IPv6 addressing information. Okay? That's basically the differences between these three methods. Okay, so let's have a look at the three array messages. Okay, what messages are used then in these three methods? Okay, so here you can see we have A flag, O flag, M flag. Okay. Right from the start, you can see A flag, O flag, M flag. So the decision of how a client will obtain an IPv6 GUA depends on the settings within the array message. So again, notice the decision of how the client is going to obtain an IPv6 global unicast address really depends on the flag type, okay, the array message, okay, what settings are contained within the array message. So when we say when we are talking about settings in the array message, we are really referring to the array message flags. So an ICMP version 6 message includes 3 flags to identify the dynamic options that are available to a host. And these are the 3 flags. A flag, okay, this is the address auto configuration, okay, address auto configuration flag. A flag, okay, A address auto configuration flag. It uses stateless address auto configuration to create an IPv6 GUA. Okay, that's A flag. Okay, so the address auto configuration flag signifies the host to use a stateless address auto configuration to create an IPv6 GUA. Okay, so you start to think now. If we go back to the previous slide, if you reverse the video a bit back to a few minutes back, where I talked about the 3 methods: Slack, stateless DHCP version 6, and stateful DHCP version 6, you can clearly see now where the A flag will be used. The address auto configuration flag signifies to use stateless address auto configuration to create an IPv6 GUA. Now the next flag or next message is an O flag. Okay, it's an O flag. Now the O represents other, okay, other configuration, which means the other information is available from a stateless DHCP version 6 server. Now the third one, M flag, the M represents managed. Okay, the managed address configuration flag signifies to use a stateful DHCP version 6 server to obtain an IPv6 GUA. Okay, so pause this video for a while and then you start to reflect. Okay, so we just talked about Slack, we talked about stateless DHCP version 6, and we talked about stateful DHCP version 6. Which of these flags is pointing to this particular option? Okay, which of these flags is pointing to this particular option? Okay, this diagram will help you. See, if you look at the A flag, it's quite clear. It signifies to use Slack to create an IP. So this means it's Slack only, which is the default. If you look at the O flag, it signifies that additional information is available from a stateless DHCP version 6 server. So this is stateless DHCP version 6. And if you look at the last flag, M flag, this is pointing to stateful DHCP version 6. Okay, so using different combinations of the O flag, the A flag, O and the M flags, array messages inform the host about dynamic options that are available. Okay, so I think this should summarize lesson 1. These are the key points. On a router, an IPv6 global unicast address or GUA is manually configured using the IPv6 address, okay, and the prefix length interface config command. So if you're going to configure an IPv6 address on a router on an interface, you go int g00 IPv6 address and then you type in the address including the prefix length. The prefix length is really the subnet mask. So you will type in the address and then you type in the subnet mask. On a host device, you will have to choose whether you obtain automatically or you will have to manually configure the address. Now if you're going for automatic, okay, if you select obtain IP address automatic, this will now depend on what option is by default. And we've seen earlier on there are 3 options available. Now for us to understand those three options and the three messages, we are looking at two types of addresses. We are looking at global unicast addresses, and we are looking at link local addresses. And we've learned that link local addresses are automatically created by the host when it boots up and it determines that an Ethernet interface is active. It automatically generates a link local address on its own. And remember that in some cases you will notice at the end of the link local address you will see a percentage symbol and a number. Okay, that's the scope ID or the zone ID. Okay, now how about the GUA? Now we learned that the decision of how a client will obtain an IPv6 global unicast address depends on the settings within the array message. And we learned that there are three options. We have Slack only, you have the stateless DHCP version 6, and then you have stateful DHCP version 6. And for these three options, they depend on three types of messages. Okay, the A flag, O flag, and the M flag. A flag, Slack only. O flag, stateless DHCP version 6. M flag, stateful DHCP version 6. Okay, so watch this video again if you haven't picked up the key concepts yet, and then try to look at the check your understanding. Our next lesson, the next video will be on Slack.